Hello everyone and welcome to today's session on Docker Compose at Intellipaat. Today we'll be diving into the powerful world of Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a tool that allows us to define and manage multi-container Docker applications effortlessly. With Compose, we can easily orchestrate complex services, networks, and volumes, making application deployment a breeze. Let's explore how Docker Compose simplifies the process of running interconnected container and making it an essential tool for modern application development. Before we move on and learn more about Docker Compose, I request you guys that do not forget to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon. So here is the agenda for our today's session. First, we'll be seeing Introduction to Docker Compose. After that, we'll see the installation and setup. Moving ahead, we'll see what is defining services, and at last, we'll see the conclusion.
So friends, let's have a thorough introduction about Docker Compose. Do you know, friends, in the fast-paced landscape of modern software development, efficient application deployment has become a critical aspect of any successful project. Docker Compose is a powerful built-in tool on the top of Docker, which addresses these needs by providing a streamlined approach to manage multi-container applications. By utilizing the concept of containerization, Docker Compose allows developers to define and orchestrate a group of interconnected services with ease. So in this presentation, we will embark on a journey to understand the fundamentals of Docker Compose and explore its various features. We will begin by installing the setup process, ensuring that everyone is ready to dive into this exciting world of container orchestration. With a clear understanding of the Docker Compose.yml file structure and syntax, we will proceed to define services, establish communication between containers, and dynamically configure our application using environment variables. Now, there's another aspect of scalability and load balancing, which we'll also discuss, which are kind of very crucial factors in any production environment. And Docker Compose enables us to effortlessly scale our services and distribute the workload efficiently. We will examine how Docker Compose handles data volumes, ensures data persistence, and facilitates seamless data management between the containers. As we will progress, we will also explore the networking capabilities, which allows us to create custom networks and control how services communicate with one another. This leads us to consider the advanced features such as Compose profiles, which enables us to tailor configurations for different deployment scenarios and also integrate Docker Compose with other orchestration tools. Throughout this presentation, we will emphasize best practices and essential tips for optimizing performance and securing our containers. Real-world use cases that will illustrate Docker Compose's practical application, from deploying web applications to implementing microservices architecture. In conclusion, Docker Compose empowers developers to simplify and expedite the deployment process, thus reducing complexities and ensuring consistency across different environments. By the end of this presentation, you will have gained a solid foundation to leverage Docker Compose effectively in your projects. So without a further ado, let's embark on this exciting journey. Now let's get started with the Docker Compose. So let us revisit what exactly is Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a powerful tool that simplifies the deployment of multi-container applications. By defining a group of interconnected services in a single configuration files, developers can efficiently manage complex setups with ease. In this section, we will explore the essential steps to get started with Docker Compose, from installation to understanding the core concepts. Now, the first one that comes up into our mind is installation and setup. Before diving into Docker Compose, ensure that Docker is installed on your system, and Docker Compose comes with pre-installed Docker on some platforms, but it might also require a separate installation on others. Once installed, verify the installation by running a simple command. Now we will see the Docker Compose docs, and let us get a brief overview how this installation and setup is done. So guys, this is the official Docker Compose docs, and in which we are just having an overview of the Docker Compose. So as you can see, Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container Docker applications. It also says with Compose, you can use a YML file to configure your application services. Then with a single command, you can create and start all the services from your configuration. So what are the features and use cases? We can start and stop and rebuild the services. We can view the status of running services, We can also stream the log output of running services, and we can also run one command on one service. These are some of the key features that makes the Compose effective. They have multiple isolated environments on single host. Then they preserves volume data when containers are created. Then it only recreates container that have changed. It also supports variable and moving compositions between environments. So guys, these are the key features which you will use one by one when we are on the platform of Docker and we are utilizing its services. Now, let us see some of the installation process. Now, if I see the installation one, so you can see all over here, there's a scenario. What are the operating systems available? So as you can see guys, for the Linux one, Docker provides .deb and .rpm packages. And for the Linux distribution architectures, we have Ubuntu, we have Debian, and we have Fedora. It uses x86 64 architecture or AMD 64. And also experimental packages available for Arc-based distribution. Docker also supports desktop on the current LTS release of the aforementioned distribution and several recent versions. Now it's very important guys that you should remember what are the system requirements required for Docker installation. Now, in order to install Docker desktop successfully on your Linux host, you must have the following general requirements. You should have 64-bit of kernel and CPU support for virtualization. You have KVM virtualization support. Then the KEMU must be version 5.2 or newer. And it is recommended to upgrade to the latest version. Then for GNOME, KDE and made desktop environment, for many Linux distros, the GNOME environment does not support the tray icons. Try to add support for tray icons, you need to install a GNOME extension. For example, it's given all over here, App Indicator. For the RAM, it should be very important that you should have at least a 4 GB of RAM. Then, in order to enable configuring ID mapping in user namespaces, see file sharing. So, you can just click on this and you can see how the file sharing is done. So I would recommend you to read these docs, which will make your installation very easy for the Linux one. Now, for the Mac users, so here we have the docker.app, which is on the Docker desktop. It basically bundles the Docker client and a Docker engine. Then you will be having a HyperKit, which is a kind of a hypervisor built on the top of the hypervisor framework in the Mac OS, and it runs completely or entirely in the upper space and has no dependencies. You can see the benefit of using HyperKit is that it is thinner than the VirtualBox and VMware Fusion. Then you could see some of the questions given all over here. Just why is com.docker vm.ntd is still running after I quit the app? So something like this happens. You can read the docs and you could get the solution all over here. I would not go deep much, but let's see what are the process. Okay. So guys, for the Mac systems, if I say what are the system requirements, so it suggests that the Mac OS must be a version 11 or the newer. Then you should have at least a 4 GB of RAM and its VirtualBox prior to the version 4.3.30 must not be installed as it is not compatible with the Docker desktop. Then what do you have to do? Install and run the Docker desktop on the Mac, which I have already told you how to install Docker desktop in the earlier videos. So you can refer to the documentation for the installation of Docker desktop. Now, how to install it? Just double click on the docker.dmg to open the installer. Then you have to click on docker.app application for the folder to start. Then what do you have to do? Then there will be this menu all over there, which is the Docker menu, and it displays the Docker subscription service agreement window. So what is there? That then the next process is to accept it and to continue it. Then from the installation window, you can select either of it. Use recommended settings, which requires a password, or you can use the advanced setting, which you can set the location of Docker CLI tools either in the system or the user directory, which enables the default Docker socket. Then select finish, and this finishes your all the way of installation and running of Docker desktop on Mac. Let us see for the Windows. So guys, this is the Windows. So for installing Docker desktop on Windows, what do you have to do guys? You should have WSL2 backend, okay, which should be a version 1.13 or 0 above. It should be a 64-bit, then it should be of 64-bit Home or Pro 21H2 build, which can be an Enterprise or an Education edition. Then enable the WSL2 feature on the Windows. For a detailed instruction, just you can click all over here for the Microsoft documentation for the WSL. So here you can get an idea regarding the same. So I will not go in detail much of these. So following the hardware prerequisites, what you should have for Windows 10 and Windows 11, which successfully are required to run WSL2 on Windows. So you should be needing a 64-bit of processor with second level address translation or SLAT, 4 GB system RAM, BIOS level hardware virtualization support must be enabled in the BIOS setting. Then you can see that it says that Docker only supports Docker Desktop on Windows for those versions of Windows that are still within the Microsoft servicing timeline. So it's very important. You can just click all over here and check what are the Microsoft servicing timeline for your version. Then you can see that containers and images are created within the Docker desktops and are shared between all the user accounts on machines where it is installed. This is because all Windows accounts use the same VM to build and run containers. Note that it is not possible to share container and images between user accounts when using the Docker Desktop WSL2 backend. So these are some of the important things which are written in the documentation. Just read it carefully and see. Now as you can see, there is something about Windows container. Let's see what it is. So if you are looking for some information on using Windows container, the first one says switch between Windows and Linux container. It describes this how you can toggle between Linux and Windows container in Docker desktops and points you to the tutorial. Okay, just click on this and you can switch between Windows and Linux containers. If you want to get started with Windows Container Lab, there's a tutorial present all over here. So you can just click on this and you will get a brief overview of how to get started with Windows Container. Then, as you can see, Windows containers on Windows 10, Windows Server 2016 and Windows Server 2019. It shows a music store application and Windows container. So you can see there is some examples would be present all over here, which will aid your understanding of getting started with the Windows Container Lab. The third one, it says that Docker Container Platform for Windows, there are certain things, new articles and blogs in order to make your understanding more clear regarding the Docker. So in order to install Docker Desktop on Windows, you can install it like interactively. Just double click the Docker Desktop installer.exe. Okay. Then when you are prompted to ensure that the use WSL2 instead of Hyper-V option on the configuration page is selected depending upon your choice of the backend. If your system only supports one or two options, you will not be able to select which backends to use. Follow the instructions on the installation wizard to authorize the installer and then you can proceed with the install. When the installation is kind of successful, you can click close to complete the installation process. If your admin account is different from your user account, you must add the user to the Docker user groups. You can run computer management as an administrator and navigate to local users and groups and Docker users. Just right click to add the user to the group and log out and log back in the changes to take the effect. If you want to install from the command line, just type docker desktop installer.exe install. Just copy this command. And if you are using PowerShell, you can just type start process docker desktop install.exe. Then wait install. You can just copy all these commands if you want to install using the CMD or the PowerShell. Now if you are using the Windows command prompt, you can just copy this code. So this is how the process will be done. Now there is something the install commands accept the following flags, which is quiet, accept license, no Windows container, allowed org, backend name, Hyper-V installation directory path, then admin settings, proxy HTTP mode, override proxy HTTP, override proxy exclude, and there are many more. I will not go in detail for these one. This is all the things which is required for you to get started with the Docker Compose. I hope so guys, it's clear to you how you can check all these things. So from this, I hope so you would have a clear idea. You can follow this documentation for the installation of Docker Compose. The next thing that comes up is understanding the Docker Compose.yml file. The Docker Compose.yml file serves as the centerpiece of Docker Compose. It is a YML-based configuration file that defines the services, networks, and volumes that makes up your application. Each service represents a containerized component of the application, such as web server, database, or backend API. The YML syntax allows you to specify the image to use, expose port, environment variables, and other parameters required for each service. Let us see on the documentation and get a more clear picture on this. So as you can see guys, in the YML file, you will get following things. The version, which will be optional, the services, which will be optional, networks, volumes, configs, and secret. The default path for a compose file is compose.yml, which can be also written as compose.yml. That is basically placed in the working directory. Compose also supports docker compose.yml and docker compose.yml for backward compatibility of the earlier version. If both of the files exist, Compose prefers the canonical form, which is compose.yml. I hope so, that's clear to you. Now, multiple compose files can also be merged together to define the application model, and the combination of YML files are implemented by appending or overriding the YML elements based on the compose file order you set. Simple attributes and maps get overridden by highest order compose file, and lists get merged by appending. Relative paths are resolved based on the first component's file parent folder whenever complementary files are being merged or hosted in the other folders. As some compose file elements can be both expressed as a single strings or complex objects. Merges apply to the expanded form only. Now if you want to reuse the other compose files or factor out the application model into separate compose files, you can also use include, which is very useful for your compose application, and it is dependent on other application which is managed by a different team or needs to be shared with the others. So this is all about the compose file. Now guys, the third one that comes up is defining the services. To define a service in Docker Compose, you need to specify its properties within the docker compose.yml file. These properties include the image to use, the ports to use, the volumes to mount, and any environment variables required for service to function correctly. Docker Compose allows you to define multiple services, and it manages their deployment and interaction seamlessly. Then comes up linking containers and communication. Docker Compose also facilitates communication between containers within the same project using the built-in network. By default, containers within a project can communicate with each other using service names such as the host names. Remember guys, they communicate with the host names. This automatic linking simplifies the container interactions, thus making it easy to build complex applications with interconnected services. Then comes using environment variables. Docker Compose allows you to utilize environment variables within the configuration file. This features enables you to make your services more flexible and configurable, thus making it easier to switch between the different environments without modifying the docker compose.yml file. Then comes up running Docker Compose. Once the docker compose.yml file is set up, you can deploy your application by running a single command. Docker Compose up. Okay guys, you can deploy your application by running a single command, which is docker compose up. Docker Compose will read the configuration file, pull the necessary images, create containers, and establish the defined networks and volumes. This straightforward command streamlines the entire deployment process. Then finally comes up managing the application, in which the Docker Compose also provides commands to manage the application lifecycle. For instance, if I have to say Docker Compose stops or halts all the services while Docker Compose starts or resumes them. Additionally, Docker Compose down removes all the services and associated networks and volumes, thus making it easy to clean up after the testing or development. In summary guys, if I had to say that Docker Compose simplifies the deployment of complex applications by allowing developers to define and manage multi-container setups using a single configuration file. Understanding the docker compose.yml syntax, defining services, establishing communication between containers, and utilizing environment variables are fundamental aspects of getting started with Docker Compose. By following these steps, you will be on your way of harnessing the power of Docker Compose and thus accelerating your application deployment process. Thank you guys for watching this video on Docker Compose. I hope so you would have got a brief idea on this subject.
Just a quick info guys. Intellipaat offers advanced certification in DevOps and cloud computing in collaboration with IIT Pravartak, a technology innovation hub of IIT Madras. This online advanced certification in DevOps and cloud computing by IIT Pravartak will help you gain expertise in DevOps access management, DevSecOps, Terraform, and more. With this course, we have already helped thousands of professionals in successful career transition. You can check out their testimonials on our Achievers channel. The link is given in the description below. Without a doubt, this course can set your career to new heights. So visit the course page link given in the description below and take your first step towards career growth in the field of cloud and DevOps.